Welcome to the Fine Print, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Caleb Teskey, and I've got a great guest for you this afternoon. I know I say that every time, but this time I mean it. Cool. Just a little housekeeping off the top as usual. Had some great guests recently. Luke Mason from NORML Labs, who had to shut his lab down out in Colorado. Great talk with Luke. Drew Greco, who's out in Nevada. Green Star Consulting. Got to get Drew back on for a part two. Josh Sweeter, Infinite Chemical Analysis Labs. If you guys haven't been following Josh, yeah, he's one to keep your eyes on there. And then, of course, I had Lester Black from sfgate.com, their cannabis editor out there doing some great stories. Let's see, coming up on Thursday, I've got a interview with a guy named Anthony Minetti, who's down in New Jersey. He's going to be the first business owner I got in New Jersey. He also is a pharmacist. I think he has a weed company and a pharmacy, so that's going to be interesting. We're going to talk a lot about rescheduling, which I think we're going to touch on probably a little bit here today as well. Then Sunday, I got Joseph Ortiz. And then on Tuesday, the 28th, I got my man Sean Mosley from Arden's Gardens right up the road here. And yeah, I think we'll leave it right there for now. Yep. As I said, great guest for you today, guys. Someone I found out about like 20 years ago, way before I was doing any of this type of stuff in college. Someone got me to sign up for the mailing list in the cafeteria. He is the founder of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. You guys probably know it as NORML. Please welcome to the show, Keith Stroup. Keith, thanks for being here today, man.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, pleasure. Before we do anything serious, would you mind, and this is going to turn into a much longer conversation, but would you mind giving us a 5-minute life story, Keith?
Well, I'm not sure that I have enough to fill 5 minutes, but at least I'll try to give you a little summary of the history. I got involved in the marijuana legalization movement because of the war in Vietnam, and more particularly, or more specifically, because of the anti-war movement. I graduated Georgetown Law School in 1968, and it was right at the height of the Vietnam War. And for my generation, my contemporaries, if you were male and you were 18 years or older and you were not a full-time student, you were drafted back then. They didn't draft women back then, but they certainly did draft every able-bodied man who was not a full-time student. So, of course, as you can imagine, for a lot of us, that gave us an incentive to stay in school as long as possible. However, I still graduated Georgetown in 68, and I was still young enough that I was susceptible to the draft. And I passed my physical, and I was given the date where I had to show up. And I had the help of some terrific lawyers from the National Lawyers Guild, and they were helping what people who were called draft dodgers back then, or draft evaders, whatever. And they offered me 3 possible ways to stay out of Vietnam. One was they would hook me up with some psychiatrists in Baltimore who were willing to say that I was gay. And back then, it wasn't don't ask, don't tell. If you were gay, they didn't want you in the military. I thought that wasn't a bad way to avoid the draft, but I was married at the time and had a young daughter, and my wife was not at all happy with this idea that her husband was going to claim he was gay. So that didn't go very far. Second, they offered me a chance to go to Canada. There's a long history of Canada accepting American dissidents who were displeased with domestic policy. The problem with that was that you never knew if you would be allowed back in the country. And while I was certainly willing to do a lot to avoid the war in Vietnam, the idea of leaving my country and never coming back, or at least the possibility that I could never come back, seemed a little extreme. The third option, which is the one that actually worked for me, there was a provision in the Draft Act called it's been a while since I've thought about this. It provided, I forget the name of the actual section, but what it provided was if the work you were doing outside of the military was important for the health, safety, and welfare of the country, critical skills deferment. That's what they called it. So if you could apply for a critical skills deferment. Well, with the help of these lawyers, I applied for that. I had been offered a job by a presidential commission right after I graduated Georgetown. It was called the National Commission on Product Safety. It was an outgrowth of the work that consumer advocate Ralph Nader had done. And so I spent the 2 years, instead of being in Vietnam, I was working around and working on the staff of this National Commission on Product Safety. Most importantly, and why this is relevant, it introduced me to the concept of public interest law. All that really means is you use your law degree and your legal skills to try to impact public policy rather than simply represent a handful of private clients. When the commission ended, it was a 2-year commission. I was 27, 28 years old. I was then too old to be drafted. And so for the first time, I had a choice about what I wanted to do with my life, starting out as a young lawyer. And I was really exhilarated by this concept of public interest law, but I wasn't that thrilled about product safety. What I was fascinated by, I had started smoking weed as a freshman at Georgetown Law School. I started smoking a lot later than a lot of smokers did. But by then, I'd been smoking 5 or 6 years, and I wanted to legalize marijuana. I was tired of having to sneak around and smoke and being thought of as a deviant, as a criminal. So I pulled together some friends and colleagues and founded NORML. And I've never looked back. It was a great decision in the sense that it allowed me an opportunity to work on issues that I never would have had a chance to be involved in. And in particular, I'm proud of the role that NORML has played in the legalization movement since that time.
Hell yeah. Thanks, Keith. And we got a couple of people watching here. Get it growing. Cheers. We got David Offenhartz. Awesome. Thanks, Keith and Caleb. Yeah, thanks for tuning in, David. It's good to see you back, man. Now, Keith, for the rest of this, I'm going to put you over in the big box.
Okay.
And there we go. I would like to kind of stay where you were at with this. You know, it sounded like you started NORML in like 1970. And like you said, this was right in the peak of the Vietnam War. And I believe right around that same time, we had the shootings at Kent State. I'm sure you probably remember some of that.
I certainly do. Yeah, it was a difficult, challenging time to be young and in America. I guess it was a difficult time to be any age in America, but especially if you were young, because we seemed to be out on the front lines. And it wasn't like we necessarily wanted to fight a war against our own government, but we were kind of forced to. We were in the corner. We either had to go to Vietnam and take a shot that we would come back in a body bag. I had had 2 fraternity brothers from my undergraduate days who, in fact, they were a year or 2 years ahead of me. They both got drafted and they both got sent home in body bags. So for my generation, we were looking for a way to start our lives on something more positive than fighting a war that we didn't understand why we were in Vietnam in the first place.
And you know, it does, like, I just get these memories of like that old term, like shotgunning, where guys were smoking weed out of the shotguns, you know, and like even the troops, it seemed like, had become sort of disillusioned with the war at a certain point and were looking for a way to just like escape the hellish like landscape they were set into.
In fact, I think that in the early years when we started NORML, good marijuana was always imported marijuana. Sometimes it was from Mexico. Sometimes it was from Thailand. Sometimes, Thai sticks, they used to call them. There were all kinds of good marijuana being brought in, but the homegrown marijuana was usually considered dirt weed. It was cheap stuff that only college students smoked, and etc. Because of that phenomena you talked about, of all these people who were drafted, who did not manage to avoid the draft, and they went to Vietnam, almost all of them experimented with marijuana. It was a terrible situation to be under. They were, their life was endangered every day they were there. And so a high percentage of them became marijuana smokers. And why that's relevant is a lot of them, when they finished their term in Vietnam, they smuggled good quality, high quality marijuana seeds home. And so the grow America market began to flourish after the Vietnam War ended. You had all of these veterans coming back, and they didn't fit the stereotype of the long-haired hippie burning his draft card in the park and smoking a joint. No, these were ordinary Americans who worked hard and tried to do what they were supposed to do, but they also enjoyed smoking marijuana. So very quickly, the homegrown market in the U.S. became the best marijuana in the world, and it remains that today. I mean, it's even better for those who've been to Holland and et cetera, or Amsterdam. The marijuana here, the best high quality marijuana, is much better than what you can get in Holland or in Amsterdam.
And get it growing. I see your comment there about rescheduling. I'm saving that for a little later, but that is on the menu for discussion here. So Keith, tell us about the first NORML chapter. How did you get that off the ground? Where was your headquarters established? Because I see NORML is now branched off. They have little chapters in every state, but tell us about the first one and how you originally got that going, and if you had any friends that helped you out with that.
Oh, always, you can imagine. We were always based in Washington, D.C., and we remain based in D.C. today. But most of the action, it's, again, similar to today, was at the state level. That is, there were some states, Texas was probably the worst in the country when we founded NORML. They were sending kids away for, caught with a half ounce of marijuana at the University of Texas, and they were getting sentences of 5 and 10 and 20 years and sent off to the Texan prison system. So what we began to do was focus on the victims of prohibition. When we started, Gallup poll had just done their first survey in which they asked Americans how they felt about legalizing marijuana. They did that in 1969, the year before we started NORML. It's interesting to realize that prior to that, the Gallup polling people didn't even think the question was important enough to ask the American people about. But what's fascinating is that the first year, only 12% of the American public supported legalization. 88% were opposed to the idea that we would legalize and regulate and have a legal market for marijuana.
And this was 1970?
Yes,
right around, yeah.
69 when they took the first one, but it stayed at that 12% level for a few years after that. So we didn't have the option of really going to legislatures and finding a sympathetic sponsor and expecting that we could move a bill to legalize marijuana forward. With 12% support, you're not going to find very many elected officials that are going to get behind it. So we thought the way to begin to build our support and begin to build a sympathy for ending prohibition was to focus on the victims. And so one of the first things we did that really worked well was we ended up, I mentioned Texas was one of the worst states back in the early 70s. And a good friend of mine who's still a very active lawyer and a prominent criminal defense lawyer by the name of Jerry Goldstein was out. He splits his time between Aspen, Colorado and San Antonio, Texas. And Jerry helped me set up a tour of the Texas prison system, in which we took a New York Times reporter, an AP reporter, and a couple of other journalists. I can't remember precisely who. That would have been in probably 71, I think. And the head of the prison system at that time in Texas was a man named George Beto. And although he had been a strong law and order guy, obviously you don't end up being the head of the prison system unless you're sort of a tough cop. But he got tired of seeing these mostly young college students being sent to his prison. He was all right for locking up regular criminals, but he realized fairly quickly that this was really doing enormous damage to a segment of our population that were of no threat to anybody. They were enjoying smoking a joint once in a while rather than having a beer or some other alcohol drink. So we contacted him, and with Jerry's help, we set up this tour where he picked out about 8 or 10 people in the prison system who were there on only marijuana charges, no violent charges. Just now, some of them were for selling; they weren't all just possession, but they were selling ounces at the University of Texas mostly. So he set up that tour, allowed me to bring in these journalists, and within a month or so, we had a New York Times cover story on focusing on the hideous results of that policy in Texas. We had a national AP story. We had some TV coverage. So it gave us, I think it was the first major story that introduced a lot of Americans to NORML and what we were doing. And that's a model that we then followed for several years. Anytime we could, for example, I remember in the early years, there was a young college student from the University of Missouri who had gone home on a spring break to visit his parents. And parents, by the way, coincidentally in this case, were both blind. One had been born blind and one had gone blind. He goes home to visit his parents on a spring break. Some young kid who he didn't know, but who was hanging out with the other kids who were home for spring break, kept bugging him to help get a marijuana joint. And he ignored him for the first couple of times. And finally, just to kind of get rid of the guy, he went ahead and sold him a half an ounce of marijuana or something like that. Well, the guy turned out to be an undercover agent. And this kid was sent to jail for, I think it was 20 years. He had no prior offenses. It was totally a nonviolent offense, but that's how serious selling an ounce of marijuana was at that point. When we found out about him, again, I called some lawyer friends of mine, including Goldstein and some others. We flew the lawyers into Missouri. We visited this young prisoner in person, and once we did that and realized that there were some bases we could appeal his conviction on, we went ahead and filed the appeal. And within, I don't know, maybe 6 months or so, his name was Jerry Mitchell, and we had gotten Jerry out of prison. He was back going to college, and the newspapers, all the St. Louis big newspapers covered it extravagantly. And so again, a lot of people in the Midwest who had never thought about legalizing marijuana and never heard about NORML, all of a sudden saw NORML not as some group that was trying to turn on America or legalize pot. They saw us as a group that was trying to protect the civil rights and personal liberty of a lot of young Americans whose only offense was that they smoked marijuana. So all during those first few years, we used that tactic wherever we could find someone who had been locked up for an especially long period of time. We would fly lawyers in. We would see if we could retry the case or find some other basis to get them out of prison.
And what kind of arguments would you use to try to appeal these cases? Do you remember any specifically, Keith?
Well, it was the first thing any good criminal defense lawyer does if you're reviewing a situation of someone who's locked up is you're looking to see if there have been some errors made at trial. Had they given him his Miranda rights, for example? Had they advised him that he had a right to talk to counsel before he talked to the police? And oftentimes, no, these were a lot of times people have been prosecuted in rural areas where they didn't pay a lot of attention to defendants' rights. They were sort of locking up anybody who got anywhere near a marijuana joint, and they felt it was justified. So the first thing we would look for is whether there had been some error made in the trial or in the prosecution. Now, if we couldn't find something that an appellate court might hang their hat on and give us a retrial, then we resorted to the appealing to the better side of the American public. And of course, we had to use the media to do that.
The better angels of our nature or whatever.
Yes, absolutely. And so even though it started off where most journalists, if they were reporting on someone who'd been convicted of a marijuana offense, they usually started off writing a story that made it sound like the person was a bad person, a guy who deserved to be in jail. But when you examine these people up close, oftentimes they were model citizens, other than the fact that they smoked marijuana. So again, we first tried to find a legal angle to have their case or have their conviction overturned to get a new trial or get resentencing even. But if we couldn't do that, then we resorted to trying to win the hearts and minds of the American people in that region. And so gradually, over the course of a few years, we built up quite a bit of name recognition and goodwill around the country. And the percentage of people who were favoring legalization was gradually increasing. By the way, I mentioned that we started off with only 12% support. Today, we actually have 70% support. Gallup and 4 other national polls right now show 70% of the American public support full legalization. Almost 90% support medical legalization, but even just full adult use, it's now 7 out of 10 Americans. One reason that sort of fascinates me is I think in the early years, we assumed if we were going to pick up the support of a majority of the American public, we'd have to turn them on. In other words, they'd have to try marijuana so they could see for themselves that it was no big deal. It didn't turn you into a raving maniac or a dangerous criminal. The allegations back then were really that serious. And the major argument was it leads to heroin. Somehow, if you smoke a marijuana cigarette, you're likely to become a heroin addict down the road.
The old gateway drug argument.
That's right. That we don't hear that much anymore, fortunately. I've been smoking marijuana for, I don't know, 58 years now, I think. I've never even seen heroin. You know, who the hell? No, I wouldn't know where to get it. I don't want to get it. I'm glad I've never seen it. But back then, that was the big scare allegation that they made. I don't know where I was going with that, Caleb, but either way, we'll pick up.
I got plenty more to keep us on track. I'm going to slap this up. I'm here with Keith Stroup, NORML founder and legal counsel. What I'd like to do, Keith, is do a little screen share real quick. I found this blog that you wrote from just about 4 years ago to the day, actually, tomorrow. And it's called Founder Looks at 50, the crucial early support from Hugh Hefner and the Playboy Foundation. And this is on the NORML.org website if you guys would like to check that out. But I was wondering if you'd tell us about that story, please, Keith.
Sure. Obviously, when I first founded the organization, one of the crucial high priority items was we had to get some funding. I just got out of law school. I don't think I had any income for the first few months, not that I remember. And so I was running NORML out of the basement in my house, downtown Washington, D.C. And I had become friends with a group called the Nader's Raiders. When Ralph Nader first came to town and began to play his role of the consumer advocate, every year he would have several graduates of good law schools come in and work for him for a couple of years at low wages and again, learn public interest law.
I liked Ralph too. He seemed like an all right guy and a fascinating character.
He is. Now, by the way, in truth, I doubt that he's ever, well, I'm sure he's never smoked a joint in his life. Ralph's a wonderful guy and he's done great creative work, but he's not exactly the kind that would experiment with marijuana when it wasn't considered mainstream. But the Nader's Raiders frequently were. And so I became friends with a lot of these young lawyers who are coming in to work with him. And one of them, by the name of John Esposito, who ended up having a fairly big job at the Consumer Advocate in New York City for a number of years. John said to me, Keith, have you looked for funding with the Playboy Foundation? Well, first off, I didn't even know Playboy had a foundation. I was certainly familiar with Playboy. Back then, the magazine had a circulation of something like 6 million subscribers a month, and each issue was passed around to between 4 and 5 people. So back before you had social media, it was one of the few ways where if you could get some good coverage in Playboy magazine, it literally put you in front of several tens of millions of people. And there weren't very many publications where that was the option. But it made me nervous to think about whether it would undermine the seriousness of our effort if we were perceived as being funded primarily by Playboy magazine. One of the people that I had gone to early when I started NORML for advice and support, and he ended up serving on our advisory board for a number of years, was former Attorney General Ramsey Clark. When Ramsey was appointed Attorney General, his father, Justice Clark, Tom Clark, had to step aside from the Supreme Court so there wouldn't be a conflict. Ramsey was a very popular Attorney General, but at some point he resigned as Attorney General because of the Vietnam War, and he became a leading opponent of the Vietnam War. In fact, he caught a lot of heat for going over to Hanoi with Jane Fonda at some point. There was a big trip the two of them took, and of course the the traditional Americans who supported that war thought that made the two of them enemies of the country. But Ramsey was someone I held in high regard. He had published a book called Crime in America that came out in either 70 or 71, in which he called for legalizing marijuana. And when I read that, I was totally surprised. And so I managed to get in touch with him and explain to him what I was doing with starting NORML, and was it a good thing to do, or was I throwing away my law degree? Would I wake up one day and regret that I had done this? And Ramsey was terribly helpful and reinforcing. He said, first off, definitely do it because it needs to be done. It's important to end prohibition and to legalize marijuana. But secondly, he said, do it while you're young so that if you fall down and fall on your face, you can get up and start over. You can always redo your career. But one of the other things I spoke to him about was, I said, should I pursue this funding from Playboy magazine or Playboy Foundation? But it was a foundation owned by the magazine and Hugh Hefner. Because I explained to him, I was worried that the feminists and a lot of people who by that point had begun to question the appropriateness of Playboy magazine, it might tarnish NORML's image as well. And Ramsey said, well, he said, I've published several books. I've been U.S. Attorney General. I've done all kinds of things. But as I travel around the country, the one thing most people come up to me and talk about is they read my interview. He had an interview with Playboy magazine at some point there. And so he said, no, I think it's quite worth it because, again, it was one of the only ways you could get your message out before tens of millions of people.
Right. I'm guessing like traditional media outlets weren't super interested in advertising any kind of legalization stuff at that time.
Oh no, they wouldn't have taken, even if you had money to buy the ads, in most of them they wouldn't have run them. They were willing to cover you if you came into their part of the country. And if you had a victim who you had gotten out of jail, they would usually give you some coverage because at some point that became a local story that had a lot of interest. But other than that, if you approached them on the basis of it's important to end prohibition and here's our message, they're going to say, what are you bothering me with that? We're a news program, we're a TV station, go play in the park. So in any event, I ended up applying to the Playboy Foundation. They sent someone out from the foundation to meet me in Washington and at least do an initial appraisal as to whether it was a serious effort they would want to be associated with. And then they flew me out to Chicago to meet with the board.
They were vetting you to make sure you were serious.
Absolutely. And I was asking Ramsey Clark the same thing about them. We were skittish to start with. Now, what happened is they flew me out for a board meeting, and Hefner and the board of the foundation, and we all sat around the big table and discussed our early ideas for NORML, etc. And they ended up at the end of that meeting giving me an offer of $5,000. And of course, on one hand, I was happy. It was the first money anyone had offered us. So that would at least allow me to pay my house payment and feed the family for a couple of weeks. But I realized $5,000 isn't going to last very long. So it was kind of frightening as to whether I should even take the money. But the head of the Playboy Foundation, executive director, was a woman named Margaret Standish. And Margaret came back to me and said, Keith, take the money, do some good work, and come back because we're excited about the possibility. If you show us that you can accomplish something, there will be more money. And sure enough, within 3 or 4 months, the foundation had agreed to give NORML $100,000 a year in cash, which of course was a big amount of money back in 1970, 71, but also to give us free ad space twice a year in the magazine. They gave us a full-page ad for free. And anytime we began to get these people out of jail or to help a victim, they would focus on it in a section of the magazine that covered, I forget what they called it now, but it covered current events. And so again, it was all a question of how do you get the message and the organization's image out in front of the American public. And certainly for the first 4 or 5 years of our existence, it was almost entirely because of Playboy. If anybody had heard of us, it was because they had read about us in Playboy magazine.
What a interesting partnership that is, Keith.
Yes, it was. And again, in all fairness, Hefner was a guy who had quit drinking alcohol a few years before that. So he smoked weed privately. Most people didn't know that, of course, because you couldn't be public about your marijuana smoking. But as I began to work more closely with the foundation, I got to be good friends with Hefner and with his assistant, Bobby Ornstein. And she would, one of her jobs back in the early years, she had a lot of important work, but one of the jobs that was important to Hefner was she was supposed to make sure that he always had several nice hand rolled joints in a box on his bedstand, so that if he ended up making love with one of the bunnies or whatever, the playmates, he had a joint handy. It ended up being a well suited marriage in that they all liked marijuana smoking. We liked marijuana smoking. We needed their ability to communicate our message to the world. So it was a partnership that worked well for all of us.
Sounds like they had some wild parties there too. maybe a little more than some weed smoking at the mansion, you know?
Well, there certainly was a lot of sex around there. There's no doubt about that. There weren't a lot of drugs, frankly. The only drugs I ever saw was marijuana. I mean, I'm sure just because it was the 70s, I'm sure that occasionally somebody must have had a vial of coke, but I honestly never saw it. And certainly Hef didn't do it. And if Hef found anybody or heard that anybody was using coke, they were off the guest list. They were not allowed to.
No shit.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh. I would not have guessed that.
Now, by the way, at the middle of by 74, Tom Forsyth, who was a marijuana smuggler, used to fly airplane loads of marijuana into this country. He had founded High Times magazine. So they became a supporter of NORMLs as well. Now, those first early years, they did not have a large audience, and so their support was not nearly as important as Playboy's. But over the years, they ended up also being a major funder of NORML, and I think they ended up giving us the last decade or two 4 or 5,000 a month, which over the course of a year helped out a lot. So we depended on both of those publications.
Yeah, and that's boy. Okay, we could probably do a whole other show just on that part, but I'm gonna I'm gonna keep it moving here because there was something you said to me on the phone. I have a quote in my notes here that said your primary focus was to stop arresting smokers or to get them to stop arresting smokers. Now, I've been watching this sort of tax and regulate model take over state to state all across the country. And one of the things I've noticed is that some of the weird legal bullshit, like the civil asset forfeiture, that seems to have not gone away, which I thought, okay, if we're going to say this is legal now, maybe we could stop taking people's shit. I don't know. Civil asset forfeiture to me always, originally it was supposed to be for people that were like involved in these big trafficking rings, but then it seemed like they just started using it to target random people, or a black guy who had a wad of cash in his car. All of a sudden they're taking his house or something like that. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because that was all I wanted from legalization, was for the cops to leave me alone. But now they've got these new DUI laws, and curious.
Well, as a criminal defense lawyer, I can assure you that the concept of civil asset forfeiture is obnoxious. What it suggests is it's even though you're a person, but they're not arresting you or charging you. They're arresting and taking possession of the property, and the offense is against it. So in the end, they seize the property, and it's almost impossible for anyone who has that happen to them to make an argument to get their property back. It's been forfeited, and sometimes if a state does it, they then hand it over to the feds because they know the feds are not going to let you get it back. It's not as prevalent today as it was in the 70s and 80s and 90s, but I'm sure it's still being used. I think today it's being used primarily in large trafficking cases, but there was a period there where you're right. Even just an ordinary person got pulled over on a speeding ticket. If they had cash in their wallet and they couldn't explain where that cash came from, or even if they tried to explain, the cops didn't like it, they would just seize the cash. I don't hear those complaints anymore, so I assume that's not happening much. And I think that's because in most jurisdictions, the police have concluded at some point that it's not in their interest to spend a lot of time and attention on these nonviolent minor marijuana offenses. They've got important work to do, and if they focus on the things that people care about, keeping the community safe for all of us to carry on our lives, then we support the police. But if they get involved in chasing down college kids because they had to have an ounce of marijuana, all of a sudden the police become the enemy. And that's not very healthy for either the police or society.
Hmm. We got a comment here from LinkedIn user, Mr. Stroup. Thank you for being a champion for the plant and for freedom. I hope someday we can achieve true legalization unencumbered by the greed and corruption of capitalism.
Well, I would agree with that. I would love to see less emphasis in the newly legal marijuana industries in various states. Right now, we have 24 states where they have totally legalized marijuana for all adults, legally regulated market, et cetera. And we have, I think it's 38 states that have legalized medical use. It's, God, I'm sorry, I'm getting sidetracked in my mind here.
It's all right. I got more, Keith. I would keep it rolling. If you have a stone moment, I got plenty more.
Okay, go ahead. But I was trying to think what he was asking me about. I was going to comment over it.
Well, I was also going to ask you about the DUI laws, and I'm here with Keith Stroup here from NORML. Do you have any comments on that? Because I've been following this pretty closely. I watched the proceedings here in Vermont where they talked about this at the advisory committee and the control board level. And to me, it felt like, well, they're basically just going to give you the same roadside test they do for alcohol. And it seemed like there's really no basis for what constitutes impairment from cannabis. And meanwhile, they're training all these new drug recognition experts to do these tests. Any thoughts on the DUI stuff, Keith?
Yes, they're basically terribly unfair because the tests that they use test for the presence of THC in your system. It doesn't test for impairment. And anyone who, even an occasional smoker, will test positive for the presence of THC in your system for several days after you last smoked. And if you're a regular long-term smoker like I am, you'll test positive for several weeks after you last smoked. But it doesn't measure impairment. You're only impaired for 60 minutes, maybe 90 minutes, and even then the impairment's far less than the impairment from alcohol. So at any event, what happens is a lot of people end up with these DUI charges, and in a number of states, about a dozen states, they have what are called DUI per se laws, which you don't have to show any impairment. If they find any THC in your system, you are absolutely guilty of a DUID. Now, in a few of those states, they put a 3 milligram requirement, and others they put a 5 milligram requirement. But in some of them, it's any. If you have any presence of THC, you are deemed to be guilty of a DUID just because you were driving your car. So it's one of the areas we still have a lot of work to do. There's 3 or 4 others like that. Job discrimination, even in the states that have legalized marijuana for all adults, in most of them, if a private employer wants to drug test you and you test positive, he can fire you, even though no indication you ever smoked on the job or that you were impaired on the job. In other words, you may have smoked the evening before at home, or you may have smoked last weekend when you had time off work. But it doesn't matter. In most states, they could still fire you for the presence of THC. There are a few, I have refusing to cooperate with me. There we go, I think. And by the way, there are a couple of other areas like that. Child custody. In most states today, if a nosy neighbor, you're in an apartment building and a nosy neighbor smells marijuana coming from a next door apartment and they know you have minor children, if they call the child welfare service, they will come out and do an emergency inspection to see if the house is clean and suitable to raise children in. In other words, the presumption is if you smoke marijuana, you must have a filthy house. How's that for an idiotic presumption? And they require the parents to take a drug abuse course and a parenting course, and those are not much better than they were back in the 1950s. And then after you jump through a couple of hoops, in most cases, you retain custody of your kids, or if you lost custody, you get them back. But we should never have parents having to justify keeping their own custody of their own children because they smoke a marijuana cigarette. That's just idiotic. So once we get over the big issue of stop arresting smokers, we can begin to focus on some of these less important, but nonetheless pretty important if you're a marijuana smoker, things that mess up people's lives. At NORML, as we get more experience, we begin to look at what our ultimate goal is a little differently. And today, what we say, we want responsible marijuana smokers to be treated fairly in all aspects of their lives, period.
Word up. Hey, can I backtrack for a second here, Keith? Because I feel like maybe you mentioned, and I wore my sweet Hunter Thompson tank top here. You mentioned maybe there was a Hunter Thompson connection somewhere in here, and I'm a big Hunter Thompson fan. It's kind of one of my big, my role models, really, and a big inspiration for how I ended up doing this journalism project.
Oh, I totally agree with you. Hunter was one of my dear friends, and he was the most interesting person I ever met in my life. And I have had, because of my work with NORML, I've had the occasion to meet a lot of fascinating people, but Hunter is my number one favorite of all of them. I first met him in 1972 at the Democratic National Convention.
Oh, nice.
We were really young at NORML. It was our first year and a half in business. But I went with, I mentioned Margaret Standish, who was the executive director of the Playboy Foundation. She flew out to D.C., and along with 3 or 4 other people that were working with NORML, we drove my Volkswagen bus down to Miami in '72. And I was, the first day of the convention, I wasn't a delegate, but they had seats where guests could sit. And so I was in watching the convention, and I began to smell marijuana smoke. And I could tell it was coming from beneath the bleachers where I was sitting. And so I looked down there and I saw this kind of gangly guy with funny how he was handling himself. And of course, I hadn't met him, but at that time he had published his first Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas in serial form in Rolling Stone. He hadn't published a book yet.
And also, this is right around the time, if I'm not mistaken, where he was working on Fear and Loathing on the campaign trail.
Oh, which was my favorite of all of his books, by the way. I thought it was a fabulous political book. It captured the essence of a political campaign better than any other political book I've ever read. At any event, I smelled this marijuana smoke. I look down there and I see this guy, and I recognize him from the photos in Rolling Stone. And so I found my way underneath the bleachers, and I walked up to him and introduced myself and said, I'm Keith Stroup, and I recently founded a marijuana legalization lobby called NORML. And of course, he hands me the joint. We smoked the rest of the joint, and we became close friends, and were friends up until the time of his death. I think it was about 15 years ago that Hunter died. But I used to go out to Aspen. I'm going out to Aspen next week for a legal seminar. But I used to go out when Hunter was alive, at least every 2 years. I'd find some excuse to go to Aspen, when really the reason I was going was I wanted to see Hunter. And so once I got out there, I'd pick up the phone and call Hunter, and he'd say, oh, come on out to the house. And so we'd every night we'd spend, Hunter sleeps all day, but he works all night. And so I'd usually meet him around 9 or 10 o'clock, and he'd have a big bag of cocaine, and he'd have a bottle of whiskey, and he'd have some marijuana, but I'd bring my marijuana too. And I'd always tell him his marijuana sucked, and I didn't want to, you better smoke my good stuff. And of course, he'd tease me and do the same thing. So we'd sit there and have a great time for 3 or 4 or 5 hours until I realized at some point, man, I got to get back to the hotel. I'm not sure I can even get home all right. And then Hunter would wake up his assistant and get to work. He'd start writing, and I was heading home. So I had some wonderful times with Hunter. I think 3 of the national NORML conventions. He spoke at a couple of them. One of them, he came, but he never left his room. He just stayed up in his room. And of course, everybody brought him drugs all the time he was there. And so he had a great time. And for most of the people that came to the conference, their biggest thrill was not the conference. It was they got to spend a couple of hours in Hunter's room, either snorting coke or smoking weed with him.
Uh,
He was truly a creative genius, without question.
oh, to be a fly on the wall in some of those rooms. Yep. And he also, there was a weird story where he, like, right before he died, or he might have died actually while he was working on this, but he got a woman released from jail, I believe, on some murder charges.
Oh no, that was before. Yeah, he. In fact, I'll tell you what happened. It happened more than once. He called me at some point. It was a period when I had left NORML and was working as executive director of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. It's the bar association for lawyers who specialize in criminal defense. And Hunter called me at some point when I was at NACDL and said, "I need your help." He had been, I forget exactly the circumstances, but a lady friend of his had been there with him, and he had been getting a little too frisky for her taste or something. So she reported him to the police and claimed that he had sexually assaulted her. Now, the reality is, I think they were undoubtedly, there was a lot of sex going on between them, but I don't think anybody was forcing it on anybody. I think they were all getting stoned and enjoying the sex. But he had used some local lawyer at first, and it wasn't going well. So he called me and asked me if I could get a couple of the big national criminal defense lawyers at NACDL to come in and assist. And I said, sure. I mean, a lot of people admired Hunter and were more than willing to help him. So I brought 3 or 4 lawyers in. I think Mike Stepanian from San Francisco and Hal Haddon from Denver and Jerry Goldstein from San Antonio. And we all met out in Denver. And sure enough, within maybe a couple of months, they had managed to get the charges dismissed. I mean, it was simply they were more experienced lawyers than what he had been relying on. So needless to say, Hunter was forever grateful. I have something hanging on my wall over there that he says the wicked accuse, what is it? The godly defend. And it's a picture of him. He had a shooting range at his house in Aspen.
Yeah, he did.
And he used to love to put pictures of Ronald Reagan and people politicians he didn't like. And he put a small paint can in front of the big poster, and then he'd stand back and shoot that paint can, and it would splatter like blood all over the canvas. And then he'd take the canvas into a studio in Aspen, have it framed, and sell it for a lot of money. There are a number of people around the country that are very proud of that art. So at any event, it was always great to spend time with Hunter. You always knew it would be a little edgy, a little bit dangerous. I mean, I remember the first time he wasn't sure. He knew I was a liberal, and he thought I might not like guns. Now, in fact, I grew up on a farm in southern Illinois, and we were hunters. We all had guns, but I haven't used one. I haven't hunted in 50 years or something. But I was familiar with guns. So one of the early trips I made to visit him, as kind of a character test, he takes me out of the house to the firing range to say he wants to shoot the gun. I said, it's fine. So we went out and shot the gun for a while. And after that, I think he thought that maybe I was more acceptable.
There's a comment from Chef Rodney. Thank you, Keith, for doing what you did to start a cannabis movement here in America. Rodney did my intro video and my outro videos. Good man here. Also has a show out in Michigan, the Daily Chronicles with Rodney. Good man. Keith, so let's flash forward here. I got a couple more for you. One thing that you mentioned to me was that you didn't want industry people on your board of directors. And I think your quote was, we knew some people thought we were just trying to get rich in this industry. We don't want to be involved in who gets rich. But tell us why you didn't want industry guys on your board of directors.
Well, it was really an outgrowth of the experience I'd had when I started working around consumer advocate Ralph Nader. If you're going to represent the interest of consumers, whatever the product is involved, then it seems to me, unless you're compromising your principles, you shouldn't be involved in making money out of that area. You're either on the consumer side or the industry side. Sometimes the two agree on a policy point, but most of the time there's tension between them. So we always knew that if we were successful at legalizing marijuana, obviously we would have a new industry created and it would be worth millions and even now billions of dollars. And the question is, how do we make sure that all of that money doesn't corrupt the legalization movement? And from NORML's standpoint, the way we could be assured of that was to stay out of the industry. Now, there are a few people who worked at NORML for a few years and later, as they got older, found a spot in the industry in a couple of states. That's fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But as for NORML, we don't. I never owned any stock in any industry company. I'm not interested in it. I wish them well. And it is interesting to see the struggle from various states as to try to come up with a regulatory model that fits everyone's needs. I don't think we're there yet. There's still a lot of focus on what they call diversity and inclusiveness, et cetera. But I don't think they've figured out how to make that work. The concept was supposed to be that those communities who paid the highest price during Prohibition, meaning Black and brown communities, we should figure out a way to give them a leg up where they make sure they get a certain share of the licenses that are going to be granted. Otherwise, you end up with a bunch of white guys running the industry, and the people who got hit hard during Prohibition gets left out of it. So a lot of states are trying that, but again, so far I think they've had trouble. For example, if it's supposed to be a minority-controlled board of directors, sometimes you've got a minority board of directors, but you've got a couple of rich guys from out of state behind them who are really running the show. So no one's figured out quite to make all of this work. But the important thing is that's the advantage of experimenting on the state level. You have 50 laboratories to experiment with. We're not looking to have the federal government dictate marijuana policy. Quite the opposite. From NORML standpoint, we want to back the federal government totally out of the picture. This rescheduling, which we'll talk about, I assume, in a minute, but we want descheduling. We don't want it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. We want to take it totally out of the Controlled Substances Act. After all, alcohol's not there, tobacco's not there, and they're both far more dangerous than marijuana. So what we want the federal government to do, and what I think will happen, there are bills pending now. It may take 3 or 4 years before we have the support to pass them, but not much longer than that, would simply remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act altogether so that the states are free to adopt whatever version of legalization they want, or if some of them want to maintain criminal penalties for a while, they can do that. When we ended alcohol prohibition, that was from like 1919 to 1931. The federal government didn't require states to legalize alcohol. They just removed federal prohibition. And there are still some counties, for example, in Kentucky and Alabama and Mississippi and Oklahoma that are dry counties. You still can't.
Like where the Jack Daniels place is, or maybe it's Jim Beam, like right there is a dry
county. Yeah. And so there will still be some of that with marijuana legalization. I'm sure there will be some counties in Oklahoma, for example, that are sure as hell not going to legalize marijuana and have retail outlets. But at least it's up to the states to decide that, and the federal government will get out of the way. Now, maybe I should jump into this Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. So
let me slap this up one more time. Keith Stroup here from NORML. We're gonna round it out here, and I was really, I was hoping to close on this. Maybe you could tell us some of the finer points of rescheduling versus descheduling. This has been a super hot topic on my LinkedIn feed of people. You know, everybody's got an opinion on this. I honestly don't know enough to really make a good stance on this, to take a good stance, you know, but it seems like one of the arguments is, oh, well, this with rescheduling, we're going to hand it over to the pharmaceutical companies or something like that. But I'd love to hear you go into some details on this, Keith.
Well, there is a fear that in essence, what the direction the government seems to be moving, makes it feel like they're trying to get ready to hand it over to the pharmaceutical companies, but the FDA is never going to approve any smoked medicine. So, indeed, to the extent that the pharmaceuticals are involved, it's not going to be flowers. It'll be some extract. But what the schedule from 1 to 3 is most helpful for is the young industry. Right now, drugs that are on Schedule 1 or 2, and marijuana is on Schedule 1 for the moment, people who sell marijuana in the various states where it's been legalized cannot take regular business deductions because Schedule 1 and 2 drugs, you're not allowed. It's at Section 280E, it's called, under the Internal Revenue Code. So what you end up with is the average retail merchant ends up paying an effective tax rate of roughly 70%. Well, man, it's not easy to make a living or to show a profit on your business if you're paying 70% tax rate. Whereas if it's moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, they'll be able to take the same kind of business expenses every other business does. They can charge off rent and salaries and, anything else that's a legitimate business expense. So it's a good step to do. I'm glad they're in the process of going from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. By the way, that'll take a few months to be effective. They've started the process this past week. The DEA issued something which officially started the countdown. But again, there's almost certainly going to be public hearings. It's probably going to be a 3 or 4 month process. But we will end up almost certainly with marijuana being in Schedule 3. So it's worth doing in that it's the first change in marijuana scheduling since the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 was passed. So it's good to see the federal government showing a little gift. It's the first time the federal government will have acknowledged that marijuana has medical use. I mean, they've been blinded by their idiotic history.
Wow, they've known that, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's idiotic to suggest. I mean, all the cancer patients, the MS patients, and seriously ill patients, it's mainly most effective for pain. So the idea that the federal government still got their head in the sand is kind of discouraging. But with this proposed move to Schedule 3, one of the changes is they acknowledge it has medical applications. So that's a good first start. But again, as to consumers, it'll have almost no impact whatsoever. As I say, I think it makes all of us feel better that we forced the federal government to loosen up a little bit, but we've got to get the federal government to go way beyond Schedule 3. It should be totally taken off of the Controlled Substances Act altogether.
And here's get it growing. I agree with Keith. Schedule 3 hands big pharma a monopoly. I told you we'd get around to this conversation. Thanks for sticking with us here. Let me ask you this, Keith. How do you feel about the concept of direct to consumer sales as opposed to having to sell everything through a dispensary?
No, I would love to have the ability to individuals who are allowed legally to cultivate marijuana. Why can't they just sell it directly? You can do that if you grow corn or soybeans or those kinds of crops. I don't see why we couldn't have the same thing with marijuana. Now, I do think you realize that one of the advantages of legalization and regulation is that the product ends up being tested in a state certified lab. So you make sure that there are no dangerous pesticides. You make sure there are no heavy metals. And in some of the black market marijuana, when it's tested, you do find levels of heavy metals and pesticides, etc.
And we're also, to be fair, we're also finding some of that in legal samples around the country as well.
That's correct. And I think with the legal samples, I think the problem is with the requirement for the laboratories. They needed to tighten up the labs. There have also been some incidents where the labs have been on the take for some of the growers, large cultivators, and they give them enough of a kickback or whatever that the lab says, oh yeah, your marijuana is fine, when in fact it's not fine. So we still need to tighten up the system a bit. But generally, one of the concerns about having the farmer be allowed to sell it directly to the consumer is that unless we figure out some way to do this that they could afford to employ, it won't have been tested at a laboratory. Now, keep in mind, I've been smoking marijuana, say, for 55 years or so. Almost every any marijuana I've ever smoked has been black market marijuana because I haven't lived where they have a legal market.
Right.
And yet, I never have an incident in which I'm aware of the marijuana harming my health. So, if I made it 55 years without being harmed, I suppose I could make it for another few years if I bought it from a farmer. So, I do favor direct sale from farmers to consumers. You bet. And
How do
by
you
the way, I do live in the state now, Virginia. I'm just across the river from DC, and they do allow individuals to grow up to 4 plants in the state of Virginia now. They haven't gone to the next step and legalized actual retail outlets. But so I grew 4 plants for the last couple of years, and marijuana is quite good. I enjoy it. And, I had a friend who was a black market grower who helped me the first years because I didn't have the cuttings and I didn't know what nutrients were needed, etc. But there are people around who can teach you those things. And so I haven't bought marijuana on the black market now for 3 years, I think, because I had enough of a crop the 2 years I did grow it that I still got more marijuana than I know what to do with.
And that was going to be, I think that's maybe my last question, but since you touched on it, what's your stance on home grow?
Oh, without a doubt, I think every state we should demand the right to grow your own, regardless of what kind of legalization system they adopt. Now, that's not the case. Understand, there are lots of states. New Jersey's one of them where you can't grow your own right now, even though they have otherwise a fairly robust legalization system. That reminded me. Let me highlight one other really exciting development in the state of New York this year. They ended up, you always have this conflict of where can people smoke? If you're middle class or you're rich, you got private space you can smoke in your house or whatever. But if you're working class or you're oftentimes even middle class, if you're living in an apartment building, they often don't allow any kind of smoking, tobacco, marijuana, or anything else. Well, then where the hell are you supposed to smoke it? Sorry. What New York did, they simply said any place it's legal to smoke tobacco, and you can't smoke tobacco standing right in front of a retail outlet, but you can go a few yards down the street. You can. You could certainly walk through a park and smoke tobacco. Well, in New York now, any place it's legal to smoke tobacco, it is legal to smoke marijuana. That's something that we need adopted in every state. It's the only state that's done that so far, but I'm sure it's not going to be the last one.
And how do you feel about this argument? One more little follow up there. How do you feel about this argument of people? They say we don't like the smell of it. I've heard that one a lot, and
Yeah,
it's weird. I've heard it a lot in New York City, which from my friends who live there tell me the city smells like piss a lot. But how do you feel about that argument? Like, I don't like the smell of it, or it's those kind of like public like
well,
nuisance.
the Florida governor has really made the biggest issue that he said on a couple of occasions that he opposed the initiative that's on the ballot in Florida this year to legalize marijuana because the whole state will stink like marijuana. And it's like, Frank, I guess it's a matter of taste. I like the smell of marijuana. I don't think it doesn't smell to me like stink, but that's because I suppose I'm used to it after 50 years. It is an issue that comes up. And so I think depending on the situation, I know there's a town right outside of Aspen in Colorado where they had some landowners fighting over that. One landowner sued the neighbor because they said the neighbor who had a license to grow marijuana, it was all legal, but they said that the whole town now was smelling like marijuana. I don't know if the worst thing anyone ever had to put up with was that they occasionally smelled marijuana smoke. It smells a lot better to me than tobacco smoke, and I've been putting up with that for 80 years. So I don't think it's a serious problem, but I realize that if you're looking for an excuse to oppose legalization, I suppose quality of life is one way to argue.
Mm. All right, Keith Stroup. I think I'm about out of shit here, Keith. I want to thank you so much for your time, man. This has been fantastic. Before we get out of here, I always leave a little minute at the end for my guests. If there's anything that we missed, or if you have any shameless plugs or shout outs that you want to do, now's the time. And please stick around after. I got a little outro video, but I'd love to just chat with you after we get done here. But thanks again for your time, Keith.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure.
I guess what I would say to the marijuana smokers out there that might be listening is we've made incredible progress in the last 10 years in particular, starting in 2012 when Washington and Colorado became the first two states to fully legalize. Now every year we won 2 or 3 or 4 more states, and I think that's going to continue. But let's not stop our work too early. Let's make sure that of course, we stop arresting smokers. But as I say, our goal at NORML is we think responsible smokers should be treated fairly in all aspects of their lives. So let's get over having to fight to maintain custody of our young kids. Let's get over this DUI bullshit. Let's get over job discrimination. Let's treat marijuana like New York State is now treating it. Any place it's legal to smoke tobacco, it's legal to smoke marijuana if you're 18 and above. Now, as a shameless plugs, go to the NORML website, sign up for our free e-zine. It's where you'd expect it, www.norml.org. Remember, there's no A in NORML. It's an acronym, and it's .org because we're a nonprofit. On the homepage, you'll see a place to click and sign up for our free newsletter. And with that, you'll get 1 or 2 emails a week, keeping you up to date on progress all around the country. Please join us. Let's finish the job.
Great place to leave it there. And please stick around. Keith Stroup. I'm going to sign off here. I'm your host, Caleb Teskey. Remember, the devil's in the details, and the details are in the fine print. Peace.